The Plura Cave tragedy. In February 2014, a group of experienced Finnish divers entered the icy waters of Plura Cave in northern Norway. Their goal was simple: to complete one of Europe's most stunning cave dives, a journey through miles of submerged passageways connecting two cave systems. They had trained for years, prepared carefully, and knew the risks. But what happened inside that cave was something no one expected. An underwater nightmare that would trap them deep beneath the surface and spark one of the most dangerous recovery missions in cave diving history. This is a fatal breakdown of the Plura Cave diving tragedy. Plura Cave is located just outside the small town of Mo i Rana, near the Arctic Circle. It's one of the longest underwater cave systems in Europe, stretching several miles through cold, narrow rock tunnels filled with crystal-clear glacial water. The cave attracts elite divers from around the world, but it's not for the faint of heart. The water is near freezing. The tunnels are long and tight, and if anything goes wrong inside, the rescue is nearly impossible. On February 6, 2014, 5 Finnish cave divers entered the mouth of Plura with a plan to swim from one end of the cave system to the other, starting in Plura Cave and exiting through a remote opening called Steinuglerflaget. The dive was expected to take several hours, with each diver carrying multiple tanks, guideline reels, backup lights, and thermal suits to survive the cold. But halfway through their journey, everything unraveled. The chaos in the tunnel escalated fast. One of the trapped divers, Tommy Kelka, struggled to maneuver his way through the bottleneck. The visibility was still gone, the guideline impossible to follow, and the cold water was beginning to take its toll. Hypothermia is a silent killer in cave diving. Your fingers stiffen, your mind slows, and small tasks become nearly impossible. Behind him, Jari Juusemäki had tried to assist, but his movement only worsened the silt cloud. In the low visibility and rising stress, Jari lost contact with the others. He was now disorientated, alone, and running low on air. A third diver, Patrick Gronkvist, realized the situation had spiraled beyond recovery. He managed to backtrack through the tight tunnel, retracing the guideline by touch alone, and finally escaped the bottleneck. He surfaced into a dry chamber further back in the system, a rare space in cave networks that wasn't underwater. There, shaken and exhausted, he waited for the others, but no one came. Eventually, 2 of the 5 divers, Patrick and another survivor, Kai Kakunpai, made it back to the Plura entrance. Their first instinct was to rush for help. But this wasn't a normal rescue situation. The others were still deep inside, tracked beyond the squeeze, with no guarantee they were even alive. The emergency responders who arrived at the scene faced a grim reality. The location of the accident was far too deep, too narrow, and too dangerous for a traditional rescue. The only way to rescue the missing divers would be to send in experts who could navigate the same deadly path, knowing full well it might claim more lives. In the hours that followed, rescue planning turned into rescue denial. Norwegian authorities consulted diving experts and quickly came to a painful decision. The conditions were too dangerous. The remaining 3 divers were presumed dead, and any attempt to retrieve the bodies was officially ruled out. The risk to additional rescuers was simply too high. Plura Cave, they said, would remain their final resting place. But the surviving members of the group weren't willing to accept that. Patrick and Kai knew exactly where their friends were trapped. They had made the same dive, faced the same dangers, and believed they could return. Against the advice of Norwegian officials, the two men began planning a recovery mission, not for fame, not for headlines, but to bring their friends home. Over the next several days, they carefully prepared. They reviewed their dive logs, rechecked equipment, and studied the layout of the cave system inch by inch. There would be no room for error. They would have to go back through the same narrow passageway that merely killed them, retrieve the bodies of their teammates, and bring them out through freezing water, low visibility, and tight rock corridors. 10 days after the accident, Patrick and Kai entered Plura Cave once again, this time not as explorers, but as self-appointed rescuers on one of the most dangerous recovery dives in history. The return dive was as brutal as expected. Every second spent underwater was a fight against time, temperature, and terrain. Patrick and Kai carried extra air tanks, additional guidelines, and modified gear setups to navigate the claustrophobic choke point where the tragedy occurred. There was no room for hesitation. Any mistake, any wrong twist, any lost grip could make them victims too. Reaching the bottleneck, they found the silt had settled. Visibility was poor, but not zero. Slowly, they inched forward, communicating through hand signals, touching the walls, checking their guidelines every few feet. And then, just beyond the tight bend, they found the first body. Jari was resting peacefully, still in his gear, wedged in a narrow corridor. He had likely passed out from oxygen deprivation before panic could set in fully. The team paused to secure his body and mark the path for extraction. Further in, they discovered Tommy and the third victim, Juha Sultangan. Both had succumbed to the same confined area. None of them showed signs of violent struggle. They had simply run out of time, out of air, and out of options. The emotional weight was immense. Patrick later described the moment as surreal, seeing their friends frozen in time exactly as they had left them. But there was no time to grieve. The extraction would be harder than the dive in. One by one, they began the painstaking process of bringing the bodies back through the bottleneck and into the main tunnel. It took multiple dives, careful rigging, and complete focus. But against all odds, Patrick and Kai succeeded. They brought all three bodies out. The recovery mission stunned the global diving community. Patrick Gronqvist and Kai Kakanpai had done what most believed was impossible. Without the support of a formal rescue operation, and despite being survivors themselves, they had returned to one of the most dangerous underwater environments in Europe and brought their friends home. The Norwegian authorities, initially hesitant, later praised the divers' precision, courage, and professionalism. But the debate around the ethics of self-rescue and body recovery in extreme cave systems reignited. Should survivors risk their lives again just to recover the dead? Was it worth it? For Patrick and Kai, the answer was clear. They had made a promise, and they kept it. The story of the Plura Cave accident became one of the most talked about cave diving events in modern history. Not just because of the tragedy, but because of the recovery. Documentaries were made. Diving courses began including the Plura scenario in their case studies. It was a reminder that even the best trained divers can fall victim to nature's unforgiving silence, and that heroism sometimes happens in the dark, far from cameras and applause. Today, Plura Cave is still open to divers, but it is treated with deep caution and respect. New safety measures were introduced, guidelines were reinforced, and access to the most dangerous areas is tightly regulated. But even with all the precautions, the memory of what happened in 2014 still lingers in the freezing waters. 3 divers lost, 2 survivors who went back, and a rescue that no one thought could happen. That is the story of the Plura Cave tragedy.